Right, okay, these are my thoughts on the poem Half Caste for what they're worth. I'll give you an overview first. So the poem explores themes such as identity and race, and people's attitudes towards these ideas and concepts. It's called Half Caste, which, if you're not familiar with the term, is it's a derogatory word or a derogatory term that is used for mixed race. It's probably not quite as commonly used as it used to be, for obvious reasons. But the poem is sort of like the author Agard, or the voice in the poem, working through, responding to this notion and attempting to ridicule it. Throughout the course of the poem, he reveals how flawed it is as a concept, as a term, and how really it doesn't make any kind of sense to use it. He ends the poem by saying he will tell the other half of his story to the listener that presumably is in no way related to race, once the listener is prepared and ready to listen. And so Agard is sort of suggesting that although sort of race and is an important aspect of identity, it's not the only aspect of it. He's got another half of his story that he could tell. Essentially, the poem is a celebration of Agard's mixed race heritage. It's vibrant and rich in its language use. There's a musicality to it in its rhyme and some of the phonology. It's quite an exciting poem in its language use and its composition, and all of those sort of come together to create, to celebrate the speaker or Agard's mixed race heritage. I think I've put something down at the bottom here, which I think sort of sums that up quite nicely. Agard says that the imposition of half on a person's total human complexity implies that some sort of purity has been subverted. So the word half caste implies that some purity is being corrupted or subverted or diluted. But Agard goes on to say that child of mixed race is a tangible, loving expression of human beings from different cultural backgrounds getting together and having children. And that shouldn't be seen as something that's threatening, that threatens purity, that corrupts it, that subverts it in some way. It should be seen as something that enriches. So, seen as something that's enriching. You get that sense in the poem through the language use and the composition, that it's a celebration of this enriching process. Right. So, as mentioned, the title is obviously the derogatory term for mixed race. It implies a corruption of purity. It opens with this really quite startling, surprising, bizarre image. Excuse me, standing on one leg, I'm half caste. It's obviously silly. It doesn't really make sense. It's nonsensical. But why being half caste would make you stand on one leg? It doesn't make sense. But I guess straight away what's happening is that Agard is introducing this idea of ridicule. He's ridiculing this idea of being half caste. He's showing how it's nonsensical, and he's making fun of the way that some people, sorry, there's a spelling mistake there, some people perceive him as somehow not being whole, as not being able to stand on two legs. He has to stand on one leg. So straight away it opens with this bizarre image. It's engaging, but also introduces sort of this mocking tone that runs throughout. Second stanza opens with a refrain that runs throughout the poem. Explain yourself what you mean. Explain yourself what you mean. You see that a number of times through the poem. Is it confrontational in tone? Perhaps, and that's certainly one interpretation. It's an imperative, that's for sure. And you could argue that it lends the speaker some authority and some power. The repetition of the imperative throughout, in my opinion, captures his desire to know what the speaker means. In a way, the word is sort of incomprehensible to the speaker. It makes no sense. So he's been genuine in his desire, perhaps. Like, what do you mean? perhaps suggesting that the people who use that language, the person he's speaking to, they don't fully understand what they're suggesting and implying. They're just sort of carelessly and casually using it. And Agard is like calling them up on that. So he is confronting them. He's asking for an explanation. Then we move into basically the poem. There's a number of images in it that mock the idea, the concept. Sorry, someone was coming in through the door of being half caste. So there's this first one here. When he compares being half caste to a Picasso painting, and he says, "What do you mean when you say half caste? Do you mean when Picasso mixed red and green, it's a half caste canvas?" Now, obviously, that's a ridiculous notion that you would call a Picasso painting a half caste canvas, because you wouldn't. And so he's saying, so why therefore would you call a person that? It's interesting, I think, that here the idea of something being mixed is actually being celebrated rather than being held, being open to scorn. If you come further down the poem, you'll see another image here when he says, like, so when you say half caste, do you mean Tchaikovsky sits down at the piano and makes a black key with a white key? It's a half caste symphony. So it's another ridiculous notion and idea. Again, it's mocking the concept of being half caste. He's making fun of it. What you'll notice here, if you watch Agard performing it, which I know you have, there's a real musicality to it. Like, do you mean Tchaikovsky sit down at the piano and mix a black key with a white key? It's a half caste symphony. It's just like beautiful reading of it by Agard, if you can find it online. A real musical quality to the sounds here, and that feeds into what I'm saying up here, that when you look at the language throughout the poem, it's rich and vibrant, it's multi-layered, it's non-conformist, it's fun, it's outside of the mainstream. It feeds into this idea of the poem being a celebration of difference. When I say the language is rich, vibrant, blah, 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 what I'm really referring to is the non-standard nature of it. So you'll notice through reading it, there's a lot of non-standard spelling, punctuation, there's plays on words, there's even some Creole dialect in there, which is a dialect used by people where Agard comes from. And so the language use is a reflection of his enriched racial status as being mixed race, I suppose. Right, okay. Oh, and a mission as well. Sorry, that's another thing that feeds into the non-standard nature of it. So what I mean by mission is when words are missed out. So what do you mean would be the standard usage, but what you mean, so you can see do has been omitted from that sentence or that phrase, which renders it non-standard, which I'm suggesting makes it more multi-layered and interesting, which therefore functions as a celebration of Agard's difference from a racial point of view. This reference to the English weather being overcast, again, it's a silly notion. So again, it's another idea that mocks the use of the term half caste. But perhaps sort of he's having a go at sort of English attitudes here, symbolic of English attitudes. Presumably he's speaking to an English person. Agard has lived in England for a huge portion of his life. So the idea that English attitudes are overcast and cloudy and miserable and grey. The play on the word cast there, half cast, overcast, injects a bit of humour, which again feeds into this idea of celebration. Skipping down through the poem, there's a section here where Agard again is addressing the listener, and he says, look, I'm sure you'll understand if when I go to shake your hand, I only offer you half a hand. He's playing on the notion that he's not perceived as a whole by these people. If you're going to call him mixed race, you're presuming that there's something about him that's incomplete. So he's playing on this idea of incompleteness, and in doing so, also I think indicates his lack of respect for these people. I'll only offer you half a hand when I shake your hand. So that kind of works on two levels. Here again, he sort of continues to play on that idea of not being whole when he talks about he only dreams half a dream, and when the moon begins to glow, he's a half-cast human being casting half a shadow. And I don't know if that strikes me as being slightly gothic, and I don't know if it's significant. Perhaps he's casting himself in the role of this sort of monstrous subhuman, this kind of like the living dead. Again, sort of perhaps playing on the idea of the way that people perceive him as not being fully whole, not being fully human. That there's something monstrous about him because of his race, and that's obviously a laughable notion. Then, right towards the end of the poem, he invites the speaker to come back with the whole of their eyes and the whole of their ears and the whole of their minds to listen to the other half of his story if they're prepared to. That for me, there's an irony here because the poem really is Agard's response to the idea that people see him as being incomplete and not whole. He's half caste. But here, the irony is that it's the listener, the person who uses the term half caste, that is in some way not fully formed. He doesn't have a whole mind or a whole ear or a whole eye. So there's a subversion of roles, you could argue, here towards the end. I also think, if you come back to see me with the whole of your mind, obviously implies that people who use these racist terms, these derogatory terms, are naturally of low intelligence. They're not giving it enough thought. They're not sophisticated in their thinking. They're not approaching the concept of race with the whole of their minds. And then it ends with this little 2-line stanza when Agard says, and if you do return and you're prepared to listen with your, with the whole of your ears and eyes and minds, then I'll tell you the other half of my story. Obviously ending on making the point that race is not entirely what defines him. There are other things that he has to say about himself outside of this world of sort of race. So yeah, that's essentially the poem. There's lots you can say about it from a language point of view, because you've got the string of images that make fun of the notion of being half caste. Then you could talk about all of the non-standard features of the poem, spelling, omission, punctuation. You can then talk about the sounds. You can talk about the play on words and the humour. You can talk about the dialect. You can talk about the symbolism of the British weather. You can talk about the images that suggest he's not a whole person. So there's loads you can talk about from a language point of view. Form and structure. Obviously, you can talk about that opening stanza and that bizarre, startling opening image and how it introduces the idea of ridicule. You can talk about the ending, which sort of shifts it to a slightly different field of view when you start saying, well, it's not just race that defines me. You can talk about the repetition, the refrains that are repeated, the anaphora. So there's a number of sort of structural and form features you can talk about as well. And one other thing perhaps you could talk about in that relation is the rhyme and the half rhyme. If you look through the poem and sort of pick out examples of that, I'm suggesting that helps generate pace and rhythm, which is important because the poem is this although it's tackling a serious issue, it's really quite upbeat. I think in a way that it's been constructed, and the rhyme and the rhythm sort of feeds into that. I've spelled rhythm wrong there, haven't I? Apologies. Okay, I hope that helps.